Hello and welcome to the Tonearm, where we connect you with the people and ideas moving culture forward. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today we're putting the Tonearm's needle on Nick Fraser, Toronto drummer, composer, and one of the most distinctive voices in Canadian improvised music. Fraser has played with Anthony Braxton, Roscoe Mitchell, and William Parker, and has led projects that range from raw, free jazz to something much harder to name. His latest record, Areas, just dropped on Elastic Recordings. It's a trio date with saxophonist Tony Malaby and pianist Kris Davis. Electroacoustic interludes by composer John Kameel Farah thread through the album, built from processed duo recordings of Fraser and Malaby. The album has weight and atmosphere in equal measure, and it's unlike anything I've heard this year. We talked about the making of Areas, what a long-term group actually sounds like from the inside, and where his music is headed. Here's Nick Fraser. I would love to start by asking you something about the beginning of the record itself. Not only the decision to open the album with a piece you didn't compose yourself, but the inclusion throughout the record of those various musical interludes. What's that all about?
Sure. The last record I made was called Fraser, and it was a duo record I made with John Kameel Farah, who is a pianist and composer mostly based in Berlin, but he's from the Toronto area. This was I think the record came out in 2024, but we had recorded a day of free improvised piano and drum duos. John is also in addition to being a pianist, he's also an electronic composer, and we just decided to take these and craft some pieces out of them. And I really loved that process and wanted to sort of keep the process. And I recorded these duos with Tony Malaby, the saxophonist, at the session for this record. These duos of me sort of playing the inside of the piano, scraping the harp of the piano with the drumstick creates this kind of wail sound. And with the sustain pedal down, you get this, all the strings resonate, you get this giant reverby sort of sound. I wanted to use them, but they didn't feel quite complete as pieces. I mean, I guess we could have just put way more reverb on Tony's saxophone and then it would match the sort of reverberation of the piano. But I thought somebody who knows more about electronic music might have different ideas and different sort of strategies about how to transform them into something complete. And I mean, John did, and they're quite different than the original improvisations. And so I figured, yeah, we'll just use them. They're scene setters, they're palette cleansers,
I think there's a couple of points on this record, and I noticed a little bit of a recurring theme as I was preparing that there seems to be this like reflecting or mirroring that other artists seem to get you to do in relation to your own music. And I'll dig into what I mean there a little more later, so you can dispute my theory as we get further into it. But I'm curious about your relationship with Farah, and how does working with an artist like that, who's doing something a little bit different than how you normally approach composition or performance or production, how do they get you to think about your own music differently? Is there an intellectual element, or is this just about feel and vibe? And
it's about feel and vibe. It's about variety too. In the past, I've made some electronic music. I used to experiment with very sort of low-tech 4-track tape stuff, and it's not generally these days how I think about music or how I hear music, how I imagine music. But I like it, and so it's refreshing. It's refreshing to work with an artist who will have this sort of transformative effect on this thing that's already been recorded. There's also a thing, I mean, this might sound silly. I feel like sometimes having a purely acoustic recording, I sometimes feel like it almost puts you in a stance as a purist or a traditionalist if you're not using any electronics. Electronics just seem to be so prominent in all music today. And again, it's not calculated, but it's just something I noticed. When I listen to the record, I go, oh, right, these parts sound more contemporary, and these other things sound less contemporary just by virtue of being purely acoustic,
It's really interesting because as you were saying that, I was thinking that by not allowing some of these modern flourishes or new tools into the palette, into the toolbox, you run the risk of almost making an unintentional statement.
Right.
You come across as a purist or a classicist when it's not necessarily what you mean.
No, exactly. I mean, I think there's a lot of territory to be mined with acoustic music and acoustic sounds, and I'm committed to jazz as acoustic music. particularly live. I'm not crazy about playing gigs where the drums are amplified and so on. I mean, I like smaller scale work. But this isn't a live performance, it's a recording. You have the luxury of treating some of the things that we're working with. It's not just treatments. I mean, it's transformation. If you heard the original improvisations that John was drawing from and making these electronic pieces, like, they don't sound really anything like what we ended up with.
That's neat.
Yeah.
It's a cliche, but it's sort of, the studio really becomes another instrument, another collaborative tool. I love that. Is it safe to say, you talked earlier about, I forgot the word you used, it had to do with intention and whether you were setting, what, if anything, you were setting out with this record. Was it an intention, or how did it come to be that there is this sort of more atmospheric tone, direction to this music, to this production?
Mm-hmm.
Again, is that something that unfolded as you were in it, or was there a statement of purpose or anything like that?
Not a statement of purpose. What I noticed was that this set of music that I wrote for piano had a little bit deeper harmonically compared to things that I've written in the past. There are just more chords and more complicated chords. The tune called Aria has got some chords that are drawn from the Messiaen piece, Quartet for the End of Time. Even just some of the titles that John came up with for his pieces, there's a slightly sort of dystopian, post-apocalyptic kind of feeling, and the cover art, I think it's Roscoe-esque. And so it's possible that because of the fact that I wrote more harmony for this project than I have in the past, that gave me a certain atmospheric zone that I was working in that I wanted to support with the electronic pieces. I'm not sure.
When you're in the composition process, are you sitting down and saying, I'm now composing a set of material for the trio? Or like when you talked about these pieces, you're composing for the piano. Were you composing for the piano, or were you composing for Kris Davis?
I think I'm more composing for the piano, but Kris is the person that I want to have play it. Kris is a phenomenal musician. What I love about her is that she uses the whole piano. I mean, she really uses the very bottom range of the piano and the very top range of the piano. And, and so she's perfect in a group like this where there's no bass. because she really uses the low register and really can fill out the sound. And she's very structurally minded in terms of her improvising. I think she's a really nice foil for Tony Malaby because he's more of a he has a sort of deconstructive energy or something like that. Although he might push back on that. I'm not sure. I can kind of just slide in there. I gave Kris a lot more to play than I gave Tony to play. Some of them, the pieces are a piano part, and then Tony's part is sort of open. And my part is, it's open too, but since I wrote the tune, I have an idea of how it's supposed to go or whatever. Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's rare, but it's somewhat infrequent that I get to speak with an artist who has had the luxury of keeping a group together, especially in jazz and creative music, to be able to return to the same home over a period of time. Mm. I'm always fascinated about what that allows over the period of time. So what I mean by that is what's possible and what the three of you can do together, or what they could do with your compositions today that maybe wasn't possible 10 years ago, or that you weren't thinking about 10 years ago.
I work with actually a fair number of groups now that are long-term projects. With Lina Alamano, her band, the Lina Alamano 4, we recently celebrated 20th anniversary. I play in a band called Peripheral Vision that's been around for going on 20 years. The groups of mine with Tony, there's the quartet with Rob Clutton and Andrew Downing on bass and cello that was together for a long time, and the trio with Kris. And it's true, we've been together for a long time, and we've known each other for longer than that. I want to say there hasn't been a ton of activity in the 10, 12 years that we've been playing.
3 records, is it? 3?
3. This is the 3rd record of the trio, yeah. And we did a larger tour in 2019, I think. We played some Canadian jazz festivals and played out in the West Coast of Seattle and so on. But it's related to the question of, are you writing for the piano or are you writing for Kris? I think the more we play together, the more I hear those things as the same. Writing for the piano is writing for Kris. The history of a group means that you're not actually starting at square one when you go to rehearse a piece. You might be starting at square 27. My friend Lina, she spends a lot of time in Berlin also, but she still keeps her Canadian band together because we get to where she wants her music to be sometimes more quickly than other people might. When she writes, that sound is ingrained in her mind. And so you're not writing sort of neutral music that can be played by anyone. It can be played by anyone. But it will be materially different when it is played by someone else.
Do you think this trio, you mentioned that it hasn't been sort of like overworked?
Definitely not.
Given your all things equal, would you work this trio more, or do you think you've got it right? Like, is this the right balance for this music and these people?
Of course, I'd always like to do it more because I love playing with them. I find my energy to be a band leader pops up every few years. And then,
yeah, sure.
And then every few years I decide, hey, I've got this record in mind or I've got this book of music and I'm going to try to find some people to play it with, or I'm going to see what Kris and Tony are up to, or I'm going to try to get Tony up to Toronto and play with the quartet again. I've got a new group called Special Topics that is with some younger people here in Toronto, Max Stover and Kay Murphy and Josh Cole. That's been it's been scratching my band leader itch for the last while. But also I love collaborating with other people. And so it's really cyclical. Sometimes I'm focusing more on my own music and sometimes I'm focusing more on Brodie West's music or Lina's or whoever.
I'm curious about the way Brodie West and the influence, I guess, or your appreciation manifests in this record. I know there's the one track, but could you tell me a little bit about what Brodie West and his music mean for you?
Sure. He's a close friend and a real inspiration as a composer and an artist. He's just he's thoroughly committed to his and doing his own thing. And so I'm really happy to be involved in that thing and those things. I think he's a great saxophone player, great composer, and just has a highly personal approach that I've never come across in any other way. You can say that about anyone, but it really is such an amazing synthesis of these things, and his approach to it is so personal that I feel like nobody's close. He loves rhythm, he loves drums. You know, he has a band called Eucalyptus that has 2 drummers and a percussionist, and he has a band called Brodie West Quintet, which has 2 drummers, and he has a duo with Evan Cartwright called Ways, which is the one that I pay tribute to on this record. He made a duo record and did a duo tour and is close friends with Han Bennick. I've been encouraging him because he did a duo gig a number of years ago in Hamilton, Ontario with Hamid Drake. And I said, you know, it's your thing. You love drums. You have a duo with a drummer. There's 2 drummers in all your bands, at least. You know, you should just call him up and just make a duo record with Hamid Drake because it was a great gig. But his focus on rhythm, obviously, as a drummer, it gives me a lot of room to play with. I don't know if I want to get into the sort of rhythmic music theory weeds about it, but we did a gig on Valentine's Day one year, and Josh Cole, the bass player, he said, he posted about it. He said, a love story between one man and the quintuplet. You know, he just has there's a lot of complex rhythmic music that's out there. And I feel like it often, when I hear that complex music, sometimes it loses the sort of folkloric element. And I feel like Brodie's music doesn't do that. Brodie's music is very relational and folkloric and sort of about us as people and how we're playing together rather than about the concepts, if that makes sense. He might push back on that. He says it's formalist and it's just about the rhythms. But anyway.
That's fascinating that it can be both things to different perceptions, right? That's one of the beauties.
Well, yeah. No, exactly.
What does it mean for a piece to devolve? What does that mean for the musicians? Like, what does it require of them? Is that a direction they're given? Is the composition dictating that? Like, I'm so fascinated by that notion.
Well, let me ask you, do you feel like there are pieces on this record that devolve?
Well, it depends on how you define it. There could be a dissolution into like complete out and free. Mm-hmm. There could be a dissolution to sparseness and ambience.
When you say devolve, to me, it evokes something where there's some kind of focus lost. It's kind of fallen into something that's different than the intended outcome.
Interesting. So there's almost a negative connotation, it sounds like. I'm picking up on it's kind of hitting you that way.
A little bit, but obviously that happens sometimes. And so, like for me, when I'm playing, I want to keep a sort of focus and an eye on the arc and the end point and be patient. If it has, quote unquote, devolved into free ambient space, I'm still trying to have a real focus on the details of that thing and not play in a general way. And, you know, be saying to myself, oh, I know what this rubato free space feels like. I don't want to be defining it while I'm playing. I want to be listening for what it is and what I can turn it into, if that makes sense. You know, we just had a CD release concert in Toronto.
Yeah.
And Kris, unfortunately, couldn't make it. And we ended up getting guitarist Ben Monder, who I'd never played with before. He's fantastic. There's a real patience and real willingness to sit with something and develop it. My friend Michael Herring, his bass player, he has this image of like, you know, when there's a parachute game when you're a kid where you have a big parachute and everyone holds their parachute. And he says like, everybody should be keeping their end of the parachute up. You know, there should be no slack in the parachute. Everybody should be focused on holding their spot and doing their thing to make the parachute have integrity. I love that image in terms of playing music, but it's true. Sometimes the thing is that we don't have that. And so we have to deal with that. So maybe that's what's happening when things devolve into something.
Yeah. This is the mystical realm of creativity that's fun to peek into. The piece I was thinking about was Sketch 57. Maybe another way to approach a similar line of inquiry is the relationship between what you write as a composer versus those places in a piece or times in a performance where it is more undetermined. And it's the area where, like, I think as a listener and as someone with passing knowledge, that's where the parachute, like, you don't know if it's going to stay tight. And then what do you do when it doesn't?
Right.
You have to recover.
Exactly. That's part of the drama. Of the music.
Yeah.
Sketch 57, it's 10 minutes on the record. But, you know, the tune itself, the part that I wrote is less than 1 minute. and it's a form. I mean, you could improvise on it as if it were a conventional jazz form, like conventional song form, but that's not what we did. Kris, after we play the material, she starts improvising. She's repeating some of the chords like for longer than they're written, and then moving to some other ones and then putting in her own. And she's playing as if it were a conventional song form, but she's making up the form as she goes, if that makes sense. And, Tony responds very well to that kind of thing. He's not going to go like, what's happening? Where are we? But it also doesn't have to be like that. I recorded that piece on a different album by a group called the Imaginary Brass Band. In that case, again, it was long, but we played the material one time and then went into a very sort of pointillistic improvisation that was a complete departure from the energy of the written material. So that idea of, are you going to continue in the vein of the thing that was written, or are you going to just discard it? I feel like that's always a very significant decision. And we didn't decide that we were going to approach it the way we did.
As part of the album release performances, did you perform that piece with Ben?
No.
Oh, interesting.
No, we just improvised. I just thought, I don't know how this stuff is going to translate to guitar. I didn't want to ask too much of him. Like, I mean, certainly in Area, the tune called Area, some of those chords have like 10 notes in them. There's only 6 strings on the guitar. I mean, if anybody could do it, it would be Ben Monder, but I just didn't want to have to figure out a way to translate the music to the guitar. So we improvised, and it was quite different than the music on the record, but we're still selling the record.
I love it. A little bait and switch there.
It was also my 50th birthday. So,
you get to reserve the right to do that then. That's your discretion. It's your discretion. It's your day.
Yeah, there you go.
Tell me a little bit, if you would, about the Toronto community.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot going on in the creative music realm there.
I think so. I get to play with a lot of people that I really like. The thing I like about Toronto is that there's a sense in which everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people are doing lots of different things. I mean, I play a lot of conventional jazz gigs, and I played in a rock band called Deep Dark United for a number of years, and I played percussion in a kind of West African banjo fusion project for a number of years. And all these things are kind of happening, and nobody feels like they need to really specialize too much. Someone like Ryan Driver writes songs. He has a band that where he sings jazz ballads exclusively. He calls it psychedelic lounge music. He plays improvised music with Titanium Riot and with a band we have with Karen Ng and Lena Alamano called The Adjacents. He has a band called The Titilators where he's invented his own instrument called the Street Sweeper Bristle Bass. None of these things conflict, whereas I feel like in New York, people want to make themselves stand out by doing one thing. Although that might be changing. That might be less true because people are a little bit more wide-ranging in their tastes and their activities than maybe in the past. There's also not, in Canada, we're really lucky that we have some arts funding that's always under threat and waning, but still there. That kind of thing gives people some freedom to function outside of a kind of capitalistic, market-driven frame.
Do you spend time writing grants and pursuing funding? Like, is that a part of your life and work?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, this particular record didn't have any funding, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Even popular music in Canada, there's an organization called Factor it's called the Foundation to Assist Canadian Talent on Record. They're partially funded by the federal government and partially funded by Canadian radio broadcasters. They fund a lot of pop music. They don't fund so much. I haven't had any luck with Factor. I'm just bringing it up to say that the arts infrastructure in Canada is heavily dependent on government funding. And I don't know that I'd have much of a career if it weren't for that.
Seems so civilized. It really does. Seems so simple and so civilized.
Oh, wow.
Could you tell me a little bit about the Association of Improvising Musicians of Toronto?
Sure. I mean, it's sort of defunct. I guess it still shows up in my bio. I'm going to say the early 2000s, some young improvisers were looking into, again, it's part of entering that infrastructure where you have a nonprofit organization that can apply for grants and put on concerts and get people paid. It was myself, Rob Clutton, Scott Thompson, who now is the artistic director of the Victoriaville Festival, which is a creative music festival in rural Quebec, the late Ken Aldcroft, a guitarist, and Joe Sorbara, drummer. Those were the sort of founding members. We just tried to put on concerts and just tried to elevate improvised music and creative music, as you say, in the sort of general scene of Toronto music. I don't know that it worked. I mean, it helped me out in terms of, it educated me in terms of how to navigate some of the funding things that exist in Canada and sort of how to build on the existing infrastructure. I don't know that we necessarily accomplished what we set out to do. Part of it was collaborating with international artists. We were able to collaborate with William Parker and with Anthony Braxton. This was after it sort of dissolved, but later we were able to do a large ensemble project with Roscoe Mitchell.
Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, it was very cool. It was very cool. Definitely a good way that we could approach festivals and so on and say, well, we have Anthony Braxton on board, so what can we do? And it worked. We did a recording in 2007 or 8 with a large ensemble conducted by Braxton. That was recorded live at the Guelph Jazz Festival.
It's interesting. When I talk to musicians and artists who are part of these sort of collectives or nonprofit, however you want to say, whenever musicians band together in these ways, it reminds me of how subcultures and countercultures work, where when you start to come together, you realize, oh, there's other people that do this weird thing I do, or that are into this thing that it's sort of like, even if it accomplished nothing other than to let everybody else know they're not alone, there's a motivating power in that.
Yeah, that's true. That's beautiful. I recently talked with a drummer, and he told me that there was a place called the Indigo Cafe that used to put on shows a long time ago. I'm going to say in the late 90s. He said, I walked in there and I was on mushrooms and you were just screaming into your snare drum. And I thought, wow, you can do that? And so he says, he was just sort of saying, thanks for that. Thanks for letting me know that you can just do stuff.
I love that.
I mean, sometimes I think about like how we wouldn't, I teach at the University of Toronto too, which is sort of its own kind of community building and fostering of community. Sometimes the students overall are amazing. Sometimes I just want to shake them and go, just do something, don't think about it, just do it. I was a guest speaker at a friend of mine's philosophy of art class, and I talked about the snare drum, the history of the snare drum a little bit, and how the snares were originally made from cat intestines that had been dried and stretched out, and how that made the drum louder. And so it made it scarier for the military. They projected further and indicated maybe more of a threat or a defense, whatever. That wouldn't happen. Nothing that exists would happen if people didn't just say, let's see what happens if we do X. And so I feel like people should do that more. They should just try things.
I'm a big fan of why not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. When you survey, assuming you ever do, when you survey your work as a leader, you cover a period of time now. You've got a body of work and over a period of time. Are you able to track a narrative or see a story in your work? How do you think about your work specifically as a leader in the context where it's sort of it's your show?
Yeah. It's funny because you can't always see your own house, because you live in it. For one thing, I would say free improvisation is a sort of pillar. Even when I write tunes, they're to be improvised on. I don't feel like I'm a sort of capital C composer where the thing exists as a discrete item could be played by anybody, as you say. And also, I look at this record that we just put out, and it's a collection of, there are no purely free improvised pieces on it, except for the electronic pieces were based on free improvised pieces. But I look back at my very first record called Owls in Daylight from 1997. There are many ways in which it's the same. There's free improvising. There are some like crude tape pieces on that record. There, that are kind of palette cleansers. And there's sections where people are playing solo. There's sections where people are playing trio, duo. Like there's lots of shifting orchestration. The tunes are sketches. They're not very involved. They're just kind of jumping off points for free improvisation, but they're specific. Sometimes I think nobody wants to think of themselves as like there's kind of like a tension or a paradox about, in jazz, people talk about finding your own voice. And they also talk about like not doing the same thing all the time and evolving. And sometimes I think, those things are actually in conflict in some way because the things you like to do make up your voice and they're your artistic voice. And so those things are the content. I doubt I'm going to make a radical change and make a pop record or a straight ahead jazz record. I doubt that's coming. Stranger things have happened, I guess.
So what happens in terms of, for lack of a better way to say it, a release cycle? So you've made, you've composed the song, you've reconvened the trio, you've put the music out into the world. Mm. Will the trio from the record be able to perform it all? Or do you now immediately move on? Like, what happens now? What mode are you in?
I would certainly perform. It's complex right now.
I would think. I
don't want to get deep into it, but when Tony was up here, he said, "Oh, are you still going down?" Because Tony lives in Boston these days, teaches at Berkeley, and he said, "Are you still going down to New York and playing a lot?" Because that's something that I would do periodically. Every once or twice a year, I would go down and play some shows in New York. I didn't make a decision not to do that with recent developments in the world. It just started to feel a little less welcoming, and it started to feel a little more difficult, not because of the musicians and community in New York. I mean, people are great. People want to play. Musicians are not the problem. Collaborating in a cross-border trio with two Americans, like, it just means something different than it did 5 years ago, which is, boy, it's too bad. I'm open to it. There's also the fact that Kris is like a jazz star now. I mean, she's on the cover of Downbeat magazine. She's Dave Holland's band. I mean, she's busy. It's hard to get her nailed down, so.
And she's a mogul there with the label. And
Yes, exactly.
I saw her a couple of months ago with her trio. Something that stands out to me about Kris's playing, I feel like you get the history of her instrument, or the modern history of her instrument. You can hear she can play the blues, she can do the jazz thing, but you can hear everything through the third stream and the modern composition. Like, she's a very modern sounding. It's just a manifestation of the piano.
21st century musician for sure.
Yeah, really something else. Nick, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick Fraser, and thank you for tuning into the Tonearm. If you enjoyed this conversation, check out the over 300 episodes available in our free archive at thetonearm.com. While you're there, join our mailing list or consider becoming a paid supporter. The Tonearm is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Brodie, spelled Burdy. Thanks for listening. Be safe and stay in touch.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonearm.com, our online journal covering unexpected music and culture. Right now on the Tonearm, you'll find features on the Smile drummer Tom Skinner, Dutch techno icon Speedy J, saxophonist and activist Caroline Davis, Lou Reed's Metal Machine music, and so much more. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter, Talk of the Tonearm. That's thetonearm.com. The Tonearm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.